Hello and welcome to this tutorial hosted by AEtudes. My name is Richard Bird, and during the next 15 minutes or so I'm going to be talking you through the tilt-shift effect. Now, whether you call this the dollhouse effect, the miniature village, shift tilt, it's a very popular effect, normally done in camera, but today we'll be looking at how we can create the same effect in post-production. Okay, new project. Double-clicking on the project file to open the import footage, taking that footage and dropping it directly onto the composition icon to create a composition the size, shape and length of the footage. Now we'll create the map which will drive the blur to create the depth of field effect that we're looking for. So a new solid. This solid is roughly twice the height of my footage to give us some room for maneuver. It's also square, which will help us with rotation. It's white, and I'm going to name it upper. I'll duplicate that by hitting Ctrl D, and I'll call the new duplicate lower. Now going back to upper, we'll throw a ramp on there, and I'll bring the top of the ramp down so it just touches the top of my composition, which in my case is around 200, and I'll end the ramp halfway up the composition, which is 500. Switch it off so that we can see the lower. Same thing, throw a ramp on, this time reverse the ramp, and we'll start the ramp at 500 and we'll finish it just at the lower edge of the composition, say around 750. All that remains is to combine the ramps into one image. So going into our transfer mode, toggle F4 if you're not already in transfer mode, we'll just apply a multiply transfer to the upper layer. Now this may seem a very long way of going around to get a simple mirror grad effect, but what you're creating is a structure which is very flexible, very straightforward and nicely labeled, and when you come to use it to manipulate the focus, it is good just having a nice clear tool to be able to do that with, rather than having to guesstimate everything. Now I'll combine these into one pre-comp, select them both, layer, pre-comp, we'll name that pre-comp focal plane. I want to switch it off in the footage layer, but I do want to double click on it to give it its own tab. So now I can easily move between the two and see where I am with both. Now we'll recreate the lens effect, which compresses the depth of field into footage. So a new adjustment layer, we'll call this one lens effect, and to it we'll apply the standard After Effects lens blur. Putting that into the adjustment layer, you can see the parameters come up straight away. Now this is a good time to point out that with the tilt shift effect, it's not a standard effect that you can apply at preset level across a range of footage. You have to tailor the effect to each piece of footage to get the results that you're looking for. One of your key weapons in doing this is the iris radius in the lens blur, which, as we can see, just simulates the effect of changing the aperture size. Now, as it happens, the default of 15 is working out quite well for this piece of footage, so I'm going to leave it at 15. Do note that the iris radius will have a significant hit on your rendering time, so try not to crank it up out of all proportion. Other tools you can use under lens blur are the specular brightness and specular threshold, just to adjust the white levels. These are not tools that I would recommend using, because we will be doing color correcting later on, which will give more control but as a cheap and cheerful solution, you could bring the threshold down to, say, 250 and maybe bump up the brightness 5, 10, 15, just to get a little bit of crush and a little bit of bloom here in the background. As I say, it's not something I would recommend, but it is there, and people do get very good results with it. Finally, switch the repeat edge pixels on just to make sure that the blur is extending to the edge of the footage. Now that we've set the basic parameters of the lens blur, we can go up to our map layer and map channel settings. Map channel we'll leave at luminance. Map layer, we will tell it to use the focal plane, the composition that we created earlier. Now already you can see that this has had an effect, with black resulting in a zero map, whereas white is giving us the full mapping effect. Which is great, it just happens to be the exact reverse of the effect we're looking for. So at this point we'll invert the depth map, and already we're starting to get something closer to what we want. Now, just judging this composition, the first thing that strikes me is I would like the line of the focus to follow these very strong diagonal lines through the footage. So we'll go to our focal plane, we'll hit the upper and lower, press R to bring up rotation, bend it just slightly, hit P to bring up position, drop it down, and we'll come back to our footage tab and see that yes, that to me looks much better. I'm much happier with that as a result. Now I have a little bit less screen space than I normally do because of the Camtasia recording, but obviously if you can fit both of your composition views side by side, so you can be having a real-time update as you move the focal plane, that would be the best way to do it. Now we'll consider our color correction. Obviously a model has a slightly more limited palette than a real-world photograph. You're dealing with surfaces that are painted, surfaces that are very small, light is hitting them in a very different way, and so we're looking to quite drastically color correct, to even overcorrect, to replicate that effect. So a new adjustment layer, which we will call color correction, and we'll begin with curves. The standard After Effects curves correction. Now, one of the very first things we want to do is just flatten out the whites and crush those blacks. Flatten out the whites on that side. There we go. Now we'll add an elbow into the curve and a knee into the dark side. Way too much. What I'm attempting to do in this process is try and flatten out these shadows so that we have much less of a tonal range within the grey of the shadow and the whites of the highlights. And this is one of the times when I don't mind sacrificing detail in the whites, because that type of fairly minute detail you're not going to see in a model anyway. Well, we could sit here doing this all day, but I'm going to be satisfied with that for the moment and bring in one of the toys you don't get to use very often in After Effects, which is brightness and contrast. We'll bring this in. Now I'm going to use the contrast to just try and flatten out the overall tonal range. See, if you take it straight down you just get grey, but we can bring in, just to help us flatten out some of those variations in colour, but simultaneously we'll push the brightness up, forcing what colours there are there to really pop out in quite a dynamic way. So what you're ending up with here is more of a primary colour effect, where you have a smaller range of very strong colours, and I think that really helps to sell the idea that this is a painted model. Still not quite happy with those darks. Okay, to finish off, the icing on the cake, the stop motion effect. Now there are a load of ways of introducing stop motion in After Effects. Probably the quickest and simplest is to go to your footage, call up your posterized time, drop it straight onto the footage. Now we see in the parameters that it's set to 24. Currently my footage is 24 frames per second. I'm going to drop that down to about 6. Preview it, hit 0, have a look at it. Now this is probably a good time to remember that a frame rate of 6 does not mean that I'm seeing every 6th frame. It means that After Effects is being forced to treat this as if it were shot at 6 frames a second, and is interpolating the frames in between. So 24/6, here I'm seeing every 4th frame. Now I'm happy with that, I'll stop it there. To make sure that we keep this frame rate, I'm going to go to my composition, settings, advanced, and I'm going to tell After Effects to preserve the frame rate when nested or in render queue, which means that it won't automatically revert back to the original footage frame rate. So there we are, the finished effect. A great fun effect to do, one of the few times you can get all of the color correcting tools out and really go wild. Certainly looks good in any portfolio. Very, very popular at the moment. A nice one to have in the armory. I hope you've enjoyed this overview of the tilt shift effect, or shift tilt effect, or dollhouse effect, or model village effect, or swing shift effect, or shift fall effect, or whatever name you know it by. It's been a great deal of fun for me to bring it to you. I'm Richard Bird for atoots.com, and until next time, goodbye.